B.S. Yediyurappa's time. So all the major policy and programs which were envisaged and implemented during his time is continuing, certainly. Plus, I have responded to the people's need of Karnataka. So these are all add-ons because I have taken over the period where COVID was on the way out and had to prepare the state to take off in its economic activity without wasting much time and instill the confidence in the people to be a part of the economic activity. That challenge was new to me. And I concentrated that, and we are doing well on that front.
I want to ask you, Chief Minister Basavaraj Bommai, what is the stamp that Basavaraj Bommai wants to leave in terms of his legacy on Karnataka? You said economic activity. What are you doing? Because in any case, Karnataka, Bengaluru is seen as the Silicon Valley of India. There's been keen competition from neighboring states and neighboring cities like Hyderabad. Mr. Bommai, how do you plan to take Karnataka forward as far as investments, business activities, as well as being the startup hub of India is concerned?
I will come to first part of your question later. Your question, how does you want to take Karnataka forward? As you yourself mentioned, Karnataka has been blessed state. It has got best of both the worlds in the sense Karnataka has got 10 agroclimatic zones. The advantage of these so many agroclimatic zones is that we grow almost all the crops and even if the rains are shortfall, there are some other crops where we do grow. Therefore, we grow from water guzzling crops like sugarcane and paddy to a dry crop like pulses. Therefore, agriculture is a very strong base of our state, basically. Now, thanks to our elders, before independence, our elders started investing in education. So we have got best of education institutions prior to independence. Then they were improved after independence. Therefore, the private sector in education was always a pioneer to take up new challenges. Hence, the education base along with agriculture is there. So we see very naturally people responding to the facts to move from agriculture to other fields. And that's how we have got highest number of skilled human strength in Karnataka than in any other state. Right from agriculture implements to IT, to space technology, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, renewable energy, you name it. There are people in that activity in a good number and very successfully. So we got best of the both world. A new technological oriented world as well as contemporary agriculture which has been modernized. So this is our strength. Myself, I want to harness these strengths. Now, if you take up per capita income of our state, even though we stand third, what I found is that 30 to 35% of the people participate in that. They contribute. But whereas still 65% of the people don't contribute, especially the women folk, SC, ST, OBC, minorities, women folk, whatever they do their activity, it is not just, it was just hand to mouth for them. So I want them to upgrade with a lot of programs, financial help. And I want to see that they also contribute in the economic activity. Therefore, then the per capita income will also improve, the GDP will also improve. So I want to convert my people to stakeholders rather than a beneficiaries. So that is a major target I have kept. So it should be people-driven economical activity, and wherein other social considerations like education, health are taken care. So this is my ambition about Karnataka. As far as leaving mark, I want people to remember me that Mr. Basuraj Bommai was a common man chief minister by the people and for the people, and he has uplifted the life of the last person of Karnataka. That is more important. I want my people to be healthy and wealthy.
I want to ask you, is the pressure, is the weight of legacy of your father, of his legacy in politics, of your predecessor, Mr. B.S. Yediyurappa's legacy in politics, weighing heavily on your shoulders when you step into the shoes of the chief minister?
Politically, yes. Because people start comparing immediately. They don't even give time. People like you, the very first day, they want me to behave like my father and B.S. Yediyurappa. Therefore, to perform to the best of the ability, that is the pressure I have. But I have worked under 5 chief ministers very closely. That experience comes very handy and helpful to me. So I convert this pressure into opportunity and get best out of me first and then my people.
Mr. Bommai, there is a controversy which is, as a forward-looking country, we must address, and that is the issue of political appeasement. I want to ask you specifically a question on whether there should be reservations in jobs for locals. Haryana has passed a bill. We understand there are pressures in Karnataka to have similar. There are pressures in all states. Madhya Pradesh in the Congress regime had passed such a bill. I want to ask you, for Karnataka, for Bengaluru, which is such a cosmopolitan city, there are head offices of various IT giants, various multinational companies. Do you think reservations in employment are really the way forward, or do you think this is short-term political appeasement which will overall impact development, growth of our country, its competitiveness, as well as become, instead of open economies, make it a closed economy and make states suffer?
Look here, that economics and social conditioning go together. A good economist or a good administrator should ride 2 horses. One is efficiency, another is equity. He has to ride 2 horses in the same direction with the same speed. That's the challenge in this country. There has been huge talk on this. But what I feel is that in a democratic setup, if the major population is not taken along, that democracy will not work for a long time. Therefore, opportunity has to be created to the classes who have been deprived. In that aspect, reservation is one big tool to see that opportunities are created. In fact, wherever I go, I see that whenever I talk to these sections of the people, I say that 3 E's are important: education, employment, and empowerment. So unless these 3 E's gives opportunity to everybody, the people who get the opportunity also will not be able to perform. So we have to balance it out, equity as well as efficiency. These two has to be balanced.
But they often say that anybody who tries to sail in 2 boats always drowns.
No, that's what intelligent
So
administrator.
you didn't use boats, you used
No,
horses.
the intelligent administrator will ride both the horses in the same direction with the same speed. That is the art of administration.
Can hold on by the fingernails, the nuclear question is held at bay, at least for now.
Thanks, Peter. Now, that brings me to the second neighbor. I mean, of course, part of the same complex. But there is some very strange behavior that China has been exhibiting. I mean,
So strange, yes.
yeah. And it's not just about the so-called Wuhan virus, which it was in the beginning, and then the U.S. Actions and reactions, and Trump and Biden, etc. Besides that, China is doing things that it has not really done for a long time. I mean, of course, starting with the Indian border skirmish, where people were actually killed. Then there are some very strong statements and actions which are happening between on the Taiwan front, and something very strange that we discussed while we were preparing for this is the notifications that several Chinese cities have been given by their government to stock up on essential supplies, food, bacon, army biscuits, etc., which they want to sort of explain it away as if it's a wintertime requirement, but winter has happened every year. This kind of notifications have not happened. And of course, then there is the sort of, they've been pursuing their billionaires, they've been pursuing their, superstar companies, and suddenly all of them, look like not so bright for the Chinese government. And this is a series of very weird behavior coming out of that place. What do you think is happening, and how do you think it will unfold?
The key thing to remember about the Chinese system in general is it's not like India, it's not like the United States, it's not like Britain, it's not like Australia. It's centrally planned. It's a fascist economic model. And so it takes a number of people, several dozen, probably several thousand actually, who are working in concert to a single goal to micromanage every aspect of the system. But for reasons financial and demographic and trade and populist, the economic model that the Chinese have been following has been failing for some time, and it's really on its last legs now. So Chairman Xi has come to the conclusion that the Chinese government can no longer guarantee economic growth, because if the Americans shut off the export markets, that goes away. If they have problems getting energy, everything goes away. So he's trying to convince the average Chinese citizen that it's not just about the economics, that it's about politics, that it's about nationalism. And so he's established a cult of personality so he can completely control that silo. That means that he has executed, imprisoned, intimidated into silence, or exiled everyone in the country who is capable of independent thought. And if anyone shows a degree of management competence that is perceived by the average Chinese citizen as to be equal or better than the Communist Party, that's a threat. That's why he's been going after the big companies. But it also means that he's shot the messenger, in some cases literally, so many times that he can't even get an accurate read of what's going on in his own country. And that's why we're getting these policy mismatches. That's why we had the electricity failures. That's why they're power rationing. That's probably where this guidance for stockpiling food has come from. That's certainly where the big nationalist decisions on Southwest Tibet or wolf warrior diplomacy or Hong Kong or Taiwan are coming from. And in this sort of environment, you can guarantee that when the guy at the top is making decisions all by himself with limited input, and no one is willing to tell the boss when, he might be wrong, he's going to make mistakes. He's going to make catastrophic, system-shattering mistakes. And so from our last talk, we talked about how the Chinese are facing a demographic collapse and an economic close down and an export collapse. We can now add incompetent leadership to the very top of that list. And in that sort of environment, I think of China as kind of now a cross between Pakistan and North Korea. One guy's in charge, making lots of mistakes, and the whole system is shaking apart.
That's quite scary. And you've also made a point about India should not worry about a strong China. India should worry about a weak China.
Yeah. Now, from an Indian point of view, a weak China is not as dangerous as a weak Pakistan. The Himalayas are in the way. The jungles of Southeast Asia are in the way. If China implodes, historically speaking, it has imploded upon itself and had very limited impact on anyone who even borders it, much less is an ocean away. Pakistan's a bigger security threat in that regard because you actually do have a land bridge that's populated. But still, this is a country of over 1 billion people. This is the center weight of the global manufacturing system. The danger to India is not a security one, it's an economic one, because India, like many countries around the world, has not yet taken the steps necessary to become a major manufacturing power in its own right. We're all dependent upon the Chinese, and we can't unwind that in a day.
Okay. So then brings us down now from the west and north down to the south of India. We talk about the Indian Ocean. Two questions here. Well, there's a lot of action happening in the Indian Ocean from basically two areas. One was the much talked about Quad, where I think two conferences have already happened. A physical conference has happened. And then in the middle of that, just before the last Quad meeting, there was a new development, which was the so-called AUKUS, Australia, UK, and US. And then there was the infamous, for the French, the submarine deal, which sort of came and put a spanner in the UK, in the French deal. So what is happening? I mean, is Indo-Pacific the new geopolitical center of the world? What does it mean for Australia to be armed with such sophisticated machinery? Is Quad therefore not really as important as I think some of us may have started imagining it to be, that there's four of us, India, Japan, and Australia and US are coming together to sort of patrol the southern Indo-Pacific. And we're going to be sort of part of this grand alliance of sophisticated economies and powers. So what does it say for India and for this region?
Well, let's deal with India last, because we need to put it all in context. So number one, the French. The French are not an Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean power. There was no way that in anything other than an American guaranteed global peace that the French could supply equipment over the long term to Australia. The French are not nearly as surprised that this deal fell through. They were more surprised when it happened in the first place. And so they were disappointed and offended, but they weren't really shocked. Second, Australia. Now, what's going on with the Australians is they have been going out of their way for quite literally decades to be the best friend of the United States that they can be. They were there in World War II. They were there in Korea. They were there in Vietnam. They were there in Iraq. They were there in Afghanistan. They have always been a creative, willing ally, and they have been lobbying Washington for decades to get the best weapon systems that they can. So from Canberra's point of view, this is the culmination of 80 years of foreign policy. And they're ecstatic. Everyone focuses on the submarines. And I don't mean to suggest that they're not important. But the real weapon system that matters here are the medium-range cruise missiles that the Australians will now have, which means that the Australians can now threaten Chinese shipping throughout the entire Malacca region. That puts Australia as one of only 4 countries in the world that can destroy China in a day. India, because it can interrupt the energy flows. Japan, because it has a better long-reach navy. The United States, of course, and now Australia. So here's a country of just over 30 million people that all of a sudden is punching 10 times above its weight. They're ecstatic. Third, the United States is retooling its alliance structure. We're done with Europe. Aside from the legacy bases in Germany, which honestly only exists still to support Middle Eastern operations, we don't have troops there anymore. So we only have a handful of allies that we're looking to maintain relationships with in the future. The United Kingdom, Australia, obviously, Japan, and Singapore. That's everything.